Welcome. I'm Paul Eakins. I'm Director of the UCL Institute of Sustainable Resources, closely associated with the UCL Energy Institute. And our topic tonight is air pollution, which obviously straddles the whole question of environmental quality and energy use. Some domestic announcements first. There's a fire escape there. There's one around the corner there. If you hear any fire alarm go, it'll be for real, because we're not, thank God, expecting any testing. The toilets are around the corner here. At the end, we'll go upstairs for a drink if you'd like to join us. That's obviously on the house, and I'll give you a few more details about that at the end. But I want to move on to the main business of tonight. We're unbelievably lucky. It's another one of the functions. Those of you who are on the MSc will have had one of London's great experts talking to you about the macroeconomy. Tonight we've got another of London's great experts giving us a seminar. It's Frank Kelly. He's Professor of Environmental Health at King's College London, our great rival, just down the just down the road here. The King's College group, he leads a group of some 40 researchers, and he tells me that the group is more or less unique because they operate London's air quality monitoring network. It's kind of the only place in the world where a university group operates something for the government in order to meet important public policy goals, or, as we may hear later, not meet important public policy goals. He's also showing the straddling role between academia and policy. He's also chair of the Department of Health's committee that is called COMEP, which stands for the Committee on the Medical Aspects of Air Pollution. He tells me it's the first time an environmental scientist, as opposed to a medic, is chairing this very important government committee. So we're enormously fortunate to have had him. Without more ado, Frank, over to you.
Thank you very much, Paul. Thank you for that warm welcome, and I'm very happy to come and talk to UCL colleagues at any time, of course. Thank you all for coming tonight. I thought I'd start with a little bit of history just to get ourselves immersed into the topic before we get on to some of the more serious parts of it. And I just wanted to remind you that, you know, there's no smoke without fire, and whether those fires were natural or whether they were eventually man-made, there has been a long history, obviously, of the human race being exposed to pollution in the form of smoke. And it's interesting the sort of the way modern technology is reminding us of that, because there's now evidence of emphysema from Egyptian mummies, and they're using CT scans to actually chart the damage which inhalation of open fires would have done to people as they warmed wherever they lived and what they cooked upon. If we move forward into 1661, then we have people like John Evelyn, who wasn't a scientist, but he was very interested in society, and he made many observations around the quality of life in cities like London. And he produced this book here in 1661 and presented it to the king at the time, which was Charles II. And just one of the statements in there: London's inhabitants breathe nothing but an impure and thick mist, accompanied with a fungulous and filthy vapour, corrupting the lungs and disordering the entire habit of their bodies. So London has been polluted really since London existed, either from open fires or from the burning of biomass in general. If we leap forward another 2 centuries, then we find that our artistic colleagues were actually enjoying the benefits of air pollution. This is one of Monet's famous series of paintings along the Thames. He lived in Paris, but he came to London every year to paint for 2 months. And this is obviously the Houses of Parliament. He sat apparently in one of the open windows at St Thomas's and painted the Houses of Parliament, which was opposite. And the reason he came to London, the light was fantastic. So the light coming down through the smogs produced these wonderful hues and colours which the Impressionists wanted to capture. If we leap forward another 60 years or so, no, more than that actually, we get up to 1952. And of course this is what is known by most people as the Great London Smog. And the only great thing about it was the concentrations of pollution which was experienced. And to just put it into context, this all starts in about 2 weeks' time. It's the first week in December, and usually every year we have quite a lot of pollution around the beginning of September. It wasn't because London or Londoners were producing more pollution that we got the smog. It was because the pollution couldn't escape from the city. So meteorology is very, very important for actually determining concentrations of pollutants. So there was a cold air front came in over the south of England, and it really trapped all the pollution that was being emitted by the city. Think of about a pot of boiling water whenever you put the lid on it. There's just nowhere for the steam to escape. And the concentrations really got very, very high indeed. This is a picture at Trafalgar Square, midday, so that's the sun, it's not the moon. And if you go on, the web, go to YouTube, just put in Great London Smog. There is fantastic footage there of conductors on buses holding torches, the bus driver coming behind them at 2 miles an hour because they couldn't see any further than that. So this was really, really a terrible event. It captured everybody's attention, finally. It captured the politicians' attention, finally. And as a consequence, then, there was real discussion, real talk about doing something about this issue. And the issue, the problem that really drove those discussions was the death rate at the beginning of December went from 150 or so per day in London up to around 500. And if you count all the extra deaths under that curve there, it comes to somewhere between 4,000 and 8,000. Just depends where you take the cutoff down here. And there's the smoke concentration, which obviously went very much in parallel. So here was very strong evidence that what you breathe can have a devastating effect on your health. And if it's as bad as that, it can actually lead to loss of life. Now, the reason that London was so polluted was because we were totally, for our energy purposes, dependent on coal. So all the power stations were coal-fired power stations. Now, whenever I do this with my students back at King's, I say, where's that? Battersea, that's the easy one. Where's that? Sorry? Yes, what was the original? Bankside, thank you. Anyone know that one? Yep, Lots Road, I believe. And this is one I always forget, but it's down the river in East London. So all these power stations were closed down by what was the Clean Air Act, which was introduced in '56. So the burning of coal was banned in the city. Generation of energy was moved outside the city, away from the people. And of course, people at that time had to use coal to heat their homes, but the new law meant that it had to be smokeless coal. So a whole form of different anthracite use, etc., was introduced. And in that way, this public act of the Clean Air Act actually did lead to a big improvement in public health. And the figures for the pollutants for the 56 Clean Air Act, there's the sulphur dioxide concentration, which is a gas that you get from coal burning, and there's the black smoke concentration. And you can see that over about a 30-year period, London's air really did change. It really did improve because of this Act of Parliament. So that's really public policy acting on behalf of the people. It was really, really good. So, here we are, 21st century. Why not visit London? Well, some days London looks like this. It did last year in December. probably put some money on it that it will do this December as well, although this year's weather is really strange at the moment. But we will have pollution episodes. I don't know if you can remember back to Easter time this year, but we had a big pollution episode, and it's very memorable because there was Sahara dust associated with it. And whenever you have Sahara dust, you actually see it. You see it on the windows, you see it in your cars and things. But many times we have pollution episodes which don't have that. And of course we have to go to the font of all knowledge really in London, which is the Evening Standard, to be reminded that in fact London's invisible killer, which is what's out there every day, including today, is the air that we breathe. And the reason that they say it's invisible is because you can't see it. But there is pollution there. And the illustration of that is that if you take a hair from your head, you can just about focus on it. Okay? That hair is 60 micrometers, 60 microns in diameter. The pollutant we're talking about these days are they're particles, they're very, very small indeed. The PM10 particles, which are the biggest ones which you can breathe, you can line up 6 of these across a human hair. But the majority of them are much smaller than that. So PM2.5, you can get 24 of those across a human hair. And in fact, many particles are in the nanometer range. That's less than 100 nanometers, or 0.1 of a micron. And they're all out there in reasonably high concentrations. Not like the concentrations of the black smoke particles, but high concentrations compared to what you would experience outside the city. So that's the modern pollution. It's invisible, but it's been linked with health effects across the world now. So, in urban areas, traffic is the main source of modern air pollution. It's the source of tiny particles, and it's the source of nitrogen dioxide, the gas which is worrying us increasingly. And if you think about London, in London there are 23,000 taxis, and 22,900 and something of them are diesel. We've got 8,000 buses, they're all diesel. In 2000, 1 in 10 new private cars was a diesel car. In 2012, 6 out of 10 new cars was a diesel car. Why have we had such a big rush towards diesel, Paul? Climate change, CO2 benefit. So there was this concept that in fact if you had a diesel vehicle, you could get more miles to the gallon. So less CO2 production per kilometre travelled. And that was true to a certain extent. I think the benefit was around 10%. But the issue about diesels are they produce a lot more pollution than petrol cars. So in fact, one of the reasons why London is struggling at the moment with its air quality is because we have so much diesel penetration into our transport fleet. In the US, they don't have this problem. All their cars are petrol. The only things that are diesel are the big heavy trucks. Likewise in Japan. China at the moment's on the edge. It could go either way. So, you know, that's one of the issues which, you know, we've got to try and make sure they don't do that, given all the other problems they have at the moment. So, what does it mean from a health viewpoint? Well, across London, poor air quality, just measured as PM2.5 concentration, is recognised to result in about 3,500 premature deaths every year. The figure for the UK is 29,000 premature deaths every year. If you put this in context of all the other things which we understand that influence our health, top of the pile comes smoking, about 89,000 premature deaths a year. Next, number 2 is air quality, PM2.5 exposure. Obesity, alcoholism, road accidents, secondhand smoke, they're all below air quality. So this is a really important public health issue. But mortality, or premature mortality, really just sits at the top of this pyramid. And we know that below that, there's lots more people who are being admitted to hospital because of breathing problems, or having to go to their GP maybe having to take more medication if they're an asthmatic or a COPD patient. And everyone is somewhere at the bottom of this pyramid, because when there's a high pollution day, you have symptoms. Your eyes will stream, your skin may feel itchy, your chest may feel tight, and then there's all these other things which are happening all the time, but you don't realize it. And I'll give you some evidence for that as we go through the talk. It used to be, and whenever I say used to be, 10 years ago, the only thing we really understood about modern pollution was that it affected your breathing, especially if you were asthmatic. The science has moved on tremendously since then, and now a whole range of endpoints diseases are associated with urban living and increased exposure to pollution. The next slide is one of the early studies which sort of pointed us towards that. So this is a not very healthy blood vessel, not a very healthy coronary artery. And this is one of the vessels which supplies blood to your heart, not the blood that your heart's pumping away, but the blood which brings the oxygen and the nutrients to your heart to allow it to do its job. At some point in midlife, for many people, they may have chest pains, they may end up having a heart attack. The reason for that is that they can't get enough blood to their heart to allow the muscle to work well. And that's because that's the diameter of vessel which the blood has to get through. Instead, it should be 2 to 3 times that size.
It's meters.
Sorry?
Meters.
Yes, it's meters, yeah. So what this study, this was in Germany, what they did was they actually, you can measure the calcium content of arteries, which gives you an idea of how badly thickened they are, non-invasively. So what they did was they recruited a whole load of people across cities in Germany, and they just related their calcification index to where they lived. So if they lived more than 200 meters away from a busy road, there was no increased calcification that was significant compared to the other parts of the study. But whenever they were living very close to busy roads, then there was this elevated risk of coronary calcification. And this has been shown now in the States and in China and in other ways. So we actually now understand that breathing bad air doesn't affect your lungs, it affects your whole body. It affects your cardiovascular system. If you're pregnant, it affects the placenta, which feeds the fetus, and it's been associated with early dementia as well, and a whole range of other conditions. So, what about London? That's what the talk's about. So this is a dispersion map of Greater London for NO2, nitrogen dioxide, annual for 2010. Just to give you focus in on this code here, anything which is below 40, so the yellow down to blue color there, green to blue, that's fine. That's below the European limit value, annual limit value for NO2. Anything above that is exceeding the limit value, so anything that's yellow or red or purple. So you can see most of central London is exceeding NO2 limit values. And quite clearly, it's the roads which light up, because that's where the cars are and that's where the emissions are coming from. Heathrow also is a problem, but it's not because of the airplanes, it's because of all the people having to get to Heathrow and having to get away from Heathrow. So it's the road transport associated with it. So imagine if we draw a line, a transect across London, and then just think of what one is being exposed to if you live there or if you're moving about between that area, if you're making a journey, for example. So there's our transect, and in this shaded area, that shows you what the actual NO2 concentrations are. So that is, as you move outside here and walk to the road, there's going to be an increasing concentration of NO2. So you get to the middle of the road, it's going to be highest concentration, and then obviously the opposite occurs the other side. And you walk maybe down a side street, whatever, you'll be back down again in one of these troughs, and then you come to another busy road and there's another big peak of exposure. So you can think about that either in relation to how you move about the city, or you can think about it if you actually live beside one of these roads. Your exposure is going to be considerably more. And that's part of the big challenge we have in our cities. If we blow up East London, this bit here, again you can see the road network very well. All these dots are schools. And we've just finished a big study in East London in schools. And of course, a lot of our schools are beside busy roads. And as a consequence, a lot of the playgrounds in schools are beside busy roads, and a lot of kids are playing there, breathing much deeper than they would do if they're sitting in the classroom, running about, taking in, unfortunately, a lot of pollution. So the study that we did went over a 6-year period. We went into the schools every year over 2 or 3 months. These are just some pictures showing you some of the things, the measurements that we did on the children. This was to get them to breathe into this machine, which gives us a measure of expired NO, nitrogen oxide. Here we're doing a lung function test on them. Here I think they're giving us a sputum sample. And then the other thing that we did with them was we did lots of education and drawing and things, and really taught them about the issues. That's the only reason the teachers would let us into the school, if they got a morning off and we did the work for them. But from this, we were able to sample these kids in this reasonably polluted area of London. And the findings, well, here's the NO2 concentration. This is modelled at their home postcode. There's the red line is at 40, which I told you was the limit value. So this is the distribution of the whole population. I think there's about 2,000 kids now in the study. So you can see actually the majority of them are exposed to higher than the limit value, which is not surprising having seen those earlier graphs. This is FVC, forced expiratory volume, and on average it's about 1.9 litres for these kids who are 8 to 9 years old. What we found was that for a child who had an annual exposure to 35 micrograms, so that's down here, they had, compared to what we would expect for that age, they had a loss of about 100 mils of lung volume at that age, 8 to 9. If they lived over here and they were exposed to 55 micrograms on an annual basis, then the loss was higher. It's about 165 mils. And whenever you start getting a loss of lung growth of that order, and if that is happening every year, this becomes clinically serious in respect of your lung grows until you're about 18 years of age. It then stops growing, doesn't do much for the next 10 years. It stays steady, and then from about the age of 28 to 30, you start to lose lung volume as you get older, and you lose about 150 mils every year. That's part of the aging process. So the idea here is that if these kids have restricted lung growth because they're living in a polluted area, and they reach the age of 18, they're going to not be able to then catch that lung growth up, because the whole normal process is stopped. They carry that smaller lung forward with them the rest of their lives. And it means then if they get some further challenge to their lung, which requires increased lung capacity, they're going to reach that tipping point, as it were, sooner than they should do. This was originally observed in California, it was what's called the Southern California Children's Health Study. It's been going now for about 20 years. Similar findings have come out of China recently, and we're just crunching all these numbers now, and we'll publish this next year. So it looks as if, you know, that's now been in 3 areas where similar sort of trends have been seen. So the other thing that we did with the children, which is the great digital developments that we have now, instead of relying on just measuring air quality with enormous big monitors, such as the one that's out there in Marylebone Road. I don't know if you've never noticed it even. It's opposite Madame Tussauds. It's the size of 2 big truck containers. It's now clad sustainably in wood, but that's the sort of thing that we have all over London, 120 of those. But because of the miniaturization of all this technology now, we can take little machines like this. This is an ethylometer, which measures black carbon or diesel emissions. And we can give it to children, or we can, if we don't trust them, we can walk behind them and make measurements. And when we did this with some of the children, a subgroup in this study, we were able to chart their exposure to diesel emissions as they went to school, as they came home from school, as they were at school. And the other thing we were getting the sputum sample, so it's like spitting out, but they do it under the influence of having breathed in some saline, NaCl, which brings up some of the lung fluid. They love doing it, you know, it's absolutely disgusting, but it gives you a sample of their upper lung, and within that there are cells which are there, which are protecting your lung, called macrophages. And whenever we analysed the macrophages, here's one here. This is not a healthy macrophage. It's dying, in fact, because of all these vacuoles which have opened up in it. But this was really interesting. This is black carbon. This is diesel. So the kids were breathing this in. Their cells were trapping it, eating it up, phagocytosing it, and that was obviously protecting them from that doing any more damage. But of course, it ultimately killed the cell. So that's direct evidence of what they're breathing in, and of course you've got the measurements to back it up. But what we find, whenever we actually split the kids up into either those without asthma or those with mild or moderate asthma, we find that in fact there was less black carbon, less loading in the macrophages in the kids with more severe asthma. And this really, really surprised us. And in fact, we subsequently did other studies in animals, whatever, and we worked out that some of the inflammation, some of the inflammatory events which you get in asthma in the airways actually was switching off the ability of these cells to do their job, to actually phagocytize the diesel, the particles. So what this means is that these asthmatics, yes, their macrophages have got less black carbon in them, but they were breathing the same amount of black carbon, so it's gone somewhere else. And it's probably doing other things it shouldn't be doing. So they're doubly at risk, I think, because of this. And the study was published in Thorax in July, and we got on the front cover of that, which is always nice. Another study, which you may have heard about, is on Oxford Street. So this was Oxford Street 1. We did this in 2007. So there's Oxford Street there. The unique thing about Oxford Street is it's only got diesel vehicles. It's got buses and it's got taxis, no private cars. So it's a very unique environment in that respect. That's a very unified type of pollution that you're exposed to. So we recruited asthmatic subjects and we asked them to walk up and down Oxford Street for 2 hours. And we measured lots of things on them. And then as a control, at some other point in time, either before or after, all randomized, we asked them to walk around the pond in Hyde Park. And the pollution concentrations are very different between those two environments. So we call this a real world type of experiment. So there's PM concentration, 72 here. There were 125 there. What else? NO2, 76 here, 11 here. So very, very different exposures. Doesn't come across very well, but here's one of the subjects, and she's actually breathing into this spirometer here. So we're taking a lung function measurement. We did it every 30 minutes as they did their walk. They came back to the hospital and we did lots of other invasive tests on them. And when we just started to look at some of that data, here we have all the asthmatics. And this is a change in FeV1, so that's forced expiratory volume in 1 second. So how much you can breathe out very quickly. It's a measure of how good your lungs are. When they were walking around Hyde Park, you can see there's a small drop in lung function, but it's not significant. When they were walking up and down Oxford Street, big drop, about a 6% drop after 2 hours. And really surprising to us, it stayed down for initially 5 hours. That's how long we were seeing them in hospital. But they came back the next morning and we took another measure and it was still down. So just walking along this street where they were breathing in elevated concentrations of diesel pollutants actually was having a real marked effect on their ability to breathe. So, if you're a scientist, you think, well, how is this happening? What's the mechanisms behind it? So what happens to diesel fumes when they enter the lung? Well, luckily, we had been doing work with colleagues in northern Sweden for a considerable time. Very, very good colleagues. The Swedes were really environmentally aware, you know that. So they had put money into developing exposure facilities up in northern Sweden where the air is very pure. And it's a place called Umeå. And we've been collaborating them for quite a while over this. So here, if we start down here, this is like a factory floor. You won't be able to see it very well, but there's a diesel Volvo engine here, set up in a block. This is the exhaust. The exhaust gets diluted down and it comes through that wall, and that's the wall there. On the other side of the wall there's an exposure chamber. In the exposure chamber we have a volunteer sitting on a bike doing a little bit of exercise. They're in there for a couple of hours. They're getting exposed to what you would get exposed to on Oxford Street. But the difference is that whenever they come out of here after 2 hours, we wheel them into the hospital ward and we do bronchoscopy on them, which means we put a bronchoscope, a fibre optic bronchoscope, down into their lungs, and we are able to either wash their lungs and take a little bit of fluid back out again to give us a window on the outside of the lungs, or we can even take a little bit of lung tissue and we can use it for examining how the lung is responding. And when we did that, following the diesel exposure, as opposed to when they're exposed to clean air, we got all these signals lighting up, just shown as red here. And these signals, cytokines, are the molecules which the lung produces whenever it feels it's under threat. And what happens is that the immune system gets activated and all the white cells come across from the circulation into the lung, looking for something to kill or to eat. So they're looking for bacteria or viruses or whatever. This is a normal protective response. However, here the stimulus is black carbon or diesel, and you can't kill that. You know, it's carbon with a lot of chemicals on the surface of it. So when we took little bits of tissue from these volunteers and measured the neutrophil numbers that came in to the lung, either after air exposure or diesel exposure, either in the epithelium, that's the surface of the lung, or just below that, the submucosa, you can see that there was a big response to the diesel. So what you get when you're walking up and down Oxford Street is you get a lot of inflammation. And of course, inflammation is one of the problems that asthmatics have when they respond to an allergen or to cold or something, and that's why the airways close down. So it's not surprising that those asthmatics on Oxford Street were responding in that way. So to summarize, 15 years of work now of probably 20 or 30 groups around the world, this is what we think happens. Environmental pollutants, be it particles, or be it ozone, or be it nitrogen dioxide, they all generate oxidative stress, reactive radicals. NO2 is a radical. Ozone is one of the most powerful oxidants we come in contact with. And these particles, it's not the carbon core, but it's all the chemicals, it's all the combustion chemicals on the surface, which are often quite a lot of transition metals and organic compounds. They lead to oxidative stress. And you have got events occurring in the fluid, which is on the surface of your lung. You've got events occurring in the cells, the epithelial cells, the macrophages. You get signals set up, which bring in more inflammatory cells which produce more radicals which increase the oxidative stress. And we now know as well that this seeps over into the systemic circulation, and you actually get, this hasn't come through very well, but you actually get activation of the endothelial cells which line your capillaries and your blood vessels, and even some of your heart cells as well. So there's a very good mechanistic basis to understand why these tiny particles and these gases are actually leading to these biological events which, if happen over a regular time, lead to what we call a disease such as COPD or heart disease. So back to London. Like many large cities in the EU, it's got a major problem in controlling its air quality, its air pollution. What is being done about it? Well, the Mayor of London's got a responsibility to try and improve air quality. So as traffic is a big problem, there is the congestion charging scheme, which is there to try and reduce the volume of traffic coming into London. And we've got the low emission zone, which is trying to improve the quality of the emissions of the traffic that still comes in to London. Both those schemes have been around for a while now. Congestion charging came in 2003. Low emission zone came in 2008, although it was staged and delayed and whatever. The bottom line, are they working? No, they're not. They're not giving us the improvements which they need to give us. And I'm happy to cover that in question times if people are interested. Just want to finish up with something which happened just very recently during the summertime. There is, as you probably know, in Parliament, a number of cross-political committees which examine various aspects of life. There is an Environmental Audit Committee, and this committee met in 2009, 2011, and again in 2014. And it's examining the government's record on improving air quality. In 2009, I gave it evidence, and the report that came out, amongst other people, the report came out was damning at the time, saying that, you know, the Labour government, which was in power at the time, wasn't doing enough. 2011, they met again, same conclusion. They've just met again this year. The report hasn't been published, but they've put out a note saying, yeah, the current government, the Conservative government, it's not doing enough to improve air quality. So it just depends whether you're in power or whether you're in opposition. The response seems to change. And the reason for this is it's not a vote winner, and it's very, very expensive, because you've got to influence society in quite a big way to make a change. But what was interesting this year, one of my colleagues was giving evidence, was that whenever they got into discussions, and this is the chair of the committee, Joan Wally, when they got into discussions and he was telling them about the school study and the equipment we have now to measure individual exposure, they got really excited and they said, oh, can you do that on us? And he said, yes. So they arranged a time for whenever they were going to visit their constituencies. We give them the equipment, explained how it worked, and off they went. The first day, though, they stayed together in London. And this is the data which the equipment recorded. So there's 3 of them here. So they started walking, you know, from Parliament. They got into the tube, had a tube journey. They went to Oxford Street because we told them it was very polluted. They came out of that, they got in a taxi, and they went to City Hall, and then they walked around City Hall, and then they got another tube journey and whatever. And when we showed them this data, they were absolutely astounded, because they really didn't have any understanding that it really depends how you move about the city and where you are as to what your exposure will be. They just thought London was polluted, and it didn't matter how you moved about. So that was all with that little piece of equipment, and my conclusion, my concluding statement is as follows. You know that your public engagement activities are working when politicians come to you and ask to be experimented on. And this is the first time I think we've really captured their attention. And we now have other people, other politicians, who are going through the same thing. And I think it's through these modern technologies that we'll actually be able to increase awareness of the politicians, which is really, really important, and increase awareness of local government and the public as well. We're doing this in various volunteer groups close to the hospitals that we work with. So that's it. Thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you, Frank. Very different to the kind of talks we've had here in the past. Extremely interesting and very, very relevant. Who wants to go out into the street now, I wonder? You don't have to yet. We're going to take some questions. There's a gentleman there, then we'll come down to the front. Lots of questions. So let's take a couple to start with, then I'll turn to Frank, and then we'll come back again. Yeah. Do you just want to introduce yourself, and then we'll know who's talking?
So I'm Arno. I'm from the MSc I have a question regarding taxis. You mentioned that most of them are diesel. Is the Mayor of London doing something about that, or what are the projects regarding these taxis?
Okay, so it's been recognised that taxis contribute a lot of London's air pollution for a long time. And for a long time, nothing was done about it. But more recently, a couple of things have happened. One, he's introduced a rule that taxis, the age limit of taxis will be restricted. And if I get my facts right, I think it's from 2017, they can't be more than 10 years old. Whereas now we've got some which are, you know, nearly 20 years old going around the city. So the idea is that that should improve emissions, because the introduction of the Euro standards will mean that we've got fresher ones on the street. The other thing that he said very recently as well is that from 2017, all new licensed cabs have to be zero emission ready. And the idea behind this is that there is a concept that he may introduce, or his successor may introduce, what's called the ultra low emission zone in London, which means that you have this area, and the only way in which you're allowed to enter that area, or at least the original plan was, that if you were zero emissions capable. So the idea would be that maybe you would be a hybrid vehicle, and whenever you're outside the zone you would go on your engine, and when you went into the zone you would switch on to the battery. Now he subsequently watered that down, unfortunately, and said that if you pay a lot more money, even if you're a diesel, you can come in. But it's all under consultation at the moment, and who knows what way it will end up.
Thank you.
Tony Edwards, architect with interest in energy. What kind of fuels for both vehicles and home heating are worse or better? We hear you talk about diesels with the small particulates and I mean, is there something in policy for both home boiler as against big power stations? There's gas, oil, fracking oil and gas, are they worse? And also cars and other vehicles. I mean, what sort of policies ought we to be pursuing in Central London? Clearly, electric cars have a place, although I'm told that producing electricity where the power station is, a big power station is producing electricity, this can produce a lot of carbon dioxide emissions, nearly very similar to a petrol car. But what sort of policy should we be pursuing, both in home heating boilers, big power stations, and vehicle fuels, to combine minimising damage to lungs and reducing carbon emissions? Has there been a combined research on the two factors?
Not the way in which you put it, but there's lots of research which would contribute towards an answer. So for power stations, one, as I've already said, they need to be away from where the people are, because they are going to have emissions. But with a power station, you can actually control and clean up those emissions quite effectively now with technology that's available. It's expensive and you've got to maintain it, but it can be done. And in respect of the fuel that produces the least pollutants, and this will be true for power generation and for transportation, is gas. So in fact, there are many cities around the world which run their public transport on natural gas. auto gas as it's called in some places. But generally burning fossil fuels like petrol and diesel and some forms of biodiesel will all produce a lot of pollutants which really need to be cleaned up before the emission is released. The problem with public transport is it's got to be where the people are that need it, and there are multiple sources of it. It's not like cleaning up a power station. So the technologies are there. They're coming on board in what we call now Euro 6, which is coming out just at this time. It should be a lot better than was there before, but it's not nearly as good as they say it is, and it's still not, even if all the fleet was turned around tomorrow, because of the volume of vehicles that we have in our major cities, we will still have a problem. And yes, domestic heating and heating in commercial buildings in London is contributing, especially to the NO2 problem. But there are, newer boiler technologies which can improve the situation a lot.
And unfortunately, that's CHP, which is bringing the big power station right back in our local hospital. It's got CHP gas boilers.
Potentially a big mistake.
Big mistake.
Potentially a big mistake, yeah.
Okay, there's a gentleman over here. Paul, you're at the back, and then we'll come down here again. Yep.
I was interested to see, we spent a lot of time talking about diesel vehicles, but the highest emission of the tube in that graph, which is electric. So I was quite interested to know why, and to what extent can you actually, what is the minimum amount of emissions you can actually have while still running a transport system in a city as dense as London?
You would need to be, I think, given that everywhere else in Europe would need to be doing the same thing, and if they weren't, you would have to have no transport in London to even get close to where we need to be. That's the reality of the situation. But it would have to be, if everything was electric, and that electric was being produced, or hydrogen, and that was fuel, those fuels were being produced appropriately elsewhere in a clean fashion, then that's about as good as you could get. The problem with the tube is it's dirty. It's dirty for a number of reasons. So we have the wheels of the tube which are grinding against the tracks. And as it slows down and speeds up as going out of the stations, we have sometimes poor ventilation coming in from roads, which is bringing in pollution, and we have a lot of grime and dust down there as well, which is always entrained up. The levels, why are they so high? That was the values there are a little bit misleading because that was measuring black carbon, and I think there is an issue with the absorbance of the particles down there in the tube, which are very metal rich. There's a lot of iron down there, and I think it's actually exaggerating the readings that we're getting. So we need to do that in another way. But to tell you the truth, it's not until very, very recently, and it had to be an MP, that London Underground would allow you to do that. So there's an issue, and we've got to realise that we've got to deal with it very carefully because it's going to be difficult to clean up, and you can't shut down London Underground.
Julian Hammer, my career journalist with BBC Current Affairs. When I came to see you a few years ago, Frank, I think the diesel ratio of cars in Britain, about half of the passenger vehicles, passenger cars, were diesel. Now it's gone up to 6 in 10 since then. And I'm just wondering, and as you say, in 2000 it's only 1 in 10. So I was wondering whether either the vehicle industry or the government show any signs whatsoever of trying to impress people with the excellence or much better performance of the petrol engine these days, and the much lower pollution it causes. Perhaps taking advantage of these, well, it's too early, I suppose, but taking lower fuel prices for getting otherwise knocked down.
So the motor manufacturing industry believes it has invested an enormous sum of money, and probably has, in the development of diesel technology. and believes it was encouraged to do that. It's not going to change round very quickly. It's not going to do a U-turn. And government is, you know, just beginning to, I think, recognise and struggle with the issue that they thought they were doing the right thing from a climate change point of view and from a CO2 point of view, but now realise that in fact there has been serious consequences. Now, whether in the next budget you will see a change in taxation, which makes petrol more advantageous than diesel, is under debate in various corners.
Let me just add to that, because I mean the development of fuel-efficient diesel engines has been the most extraordinary thing, and in this country it may indeed have been taken up partly because of the greater fuel efficiency of the diesel engine, but the push towards the diesel engine on the continent has been driven very largely by the fact that diesel is taxed on the continent at a much, much lower level than it is taxed in this country. So the fuel efficiency effect on the continent is completely amplified by the fact that not only are they more fuel efficient, but the tax they pay is very often less than half the tax that they pay on gasoline engines. So it's been driven very largely by income effects, by price, by this differential taxation. And it's so far proved impossible, despite the fact the European Commission is trying to raise minimum levels of diesel taxation on the continent. Obviously, very strong road lobby and very strong haulage lobby has so far managed to overcome that. So the UK is the only country in Europe that taxes diesel at the same level as petrol. And of course, from an environmental economics point of view, that's crazy, because diesel does much more damage than petrol. So diesel should be more highly taxed than petrol. The UK is the only country in Europe that does that. So it's absolutely fascinating the way public policy is driven by these things. Lady here.
Yes, I'm Gail Brady. I've got a master's in environmental ecology, and in New York and Paris I have seen sparrows. In London we have lost our sparrows. Do you think there's any, is the sparrow like the coal miners' area to design that killing off birds as well as
I wish I felt smart enough to answer that question. You know, there is a number of instances of biodiversity issues across the UK. I mean, I've heard about the problem with the bee population could partly be due to pollution in and around cities. But I don't have the expertise to answer your question, I'm afraid. I'm sorry.
Gentleman there, then I'll come over here.
You mentioned though 4,000 to 8,000 premature deaths because of air pollution. What precisely do you mean by premature death? Can it be quantified? I think somebody who dies perhaps one day before they would otherwise die, or that's the first question. Precisely what does that mean? And secondly, the limit values. How are these determined? You know, so many micrograms per cubic meter or whatever. How are these determined? Okay,
so everything is derived from observational studies. Originally, they were all North American when we got our first set of standards in the 90s. But since then, Europe's got very strong data. Far East has got very strong data as well. So the first, the limit value itself, how is it derived? The WHO was commissioned by the European Commission to bring together experts to look at all the health evidence. And when you look at the epidemiology, you can relate the health effects, be it cardiovascular disease or be it early death, against the background pollutant concentration where that study has been done. So you can't do this from one study. You've got to do it from hundreds of studies. And when you have that, and you've got millions of observations, then you start to see a picture emerge. And you see that at the moment, if we take particles, which is a very good example, we have no observations of health effects of particles, PM2.5, below 8 microns per meter cubed. Above that, we have got increasing relationships between concentration and health outcome. So, the WHO publishes that information. It's usually gathered about every 8 years. It's given to the European Commission, and then the European Commission take it and they use it as part of the basis for deciding where they're going to set their number. So when they did this the last time for PM2.5, and they were the recommendation to them was to pick a number of 10, because that would protect the majority of the population, the European Commission decided to pick a value of 25. And that was based on the fact that lots of the Eastern Bloc countries wouldn't have a chance of getting anywhere near 10. And for most people to get down to 10, it would be very, very expensive. So in fact, for particles, we have a limit value in Europe which is not protecting health. We're just about beginning to meet it in most countries, but it's not a health-based limit value. So there's economics comes into it as well as practicability. Your first question was, what does a premature death mean? Well, for London, it's 3,500 is the estimate, and the loss of life is calculated as 11.5 years for all of those 3,500 people. But we, of course, know that that's only a mathematical output. So, in fact, in reality, we think that some people are losing a few weeks, and we think some people are losing a lot more time. But no one gets died from air quality, poor air quality, on their death certificate. They die from cardiovascular disease or COPD or whatever. So these are just this is information which is gleaned from all these health studies across the world.
So what was the average value again? I didn't catch it.
Of loss of life,
yeah.
11.5 years.
11.5 years.
Yes.
So if you multiply that by 3,500, that's person years loss.
Yeah. Yeah.
Per year.
Yeah. And that can be then fed into the economics whenever you're trying to decide how much money you spend to solve the problem.
There's a gentleman there who's been waiting a bit. We've got 4 or 5 questions on this side now, so I'm going to stay over here.
Congratulations on all the stuff you've been doing. It's fantastic. We put your stuff on our website. You're taking the UK to the European Court.
Not personally, but yes.
Right. I was just wondering, one, what are the arguments you're using? Are you asking to reduce air pollution because we're infringing the limit? Or are you arguing that we should have new designs of cities, sort of radical change? And the second thing is, what are the effects of vegetation on absorption of PM10 2.5?
So the legal case is based solely around the fact that there is a limit value set in law with a time associated with it. And for NO2, it was the 1st of January 2010. And countries who thought they couldn't make the 40 micrograms per meter cubed had up to 2015, that a 5-year period to do something about it. The issue with the UK and why it's being pulled through the European Courts of Justice is that it didn't make the limit value by 2010, and then it didn't come up with a plan to make it by 2015. So it's as simple as that. There's no hope that air quality from an NO2 point of view will improve based on the current policies, and that's really where the UK government is being attacked. So there was a ruling out yesterday from the European Court of Justice to say that the UK were at fault, and the direction was for the UK courts to now take action against the UK government. And in reality, I assume what will happen now is that the government will be forced to actually come up with an action plan, which, you know, we can sit and discuss for the next month, but it's pretty obvious that, you know, we have the problem in our cities. We've got too much traffic producing too much pollution. A lot of it is public transport, so that's under the control of government. So they're going to have to really come up with an improvement in how we move people around our cities. In respect of, so it's all to do with the current problem we have and the current city layout we have. There is nothing within this discussion to say, actually, we could do things better if we designed our cities better, either from scratch or by retrofitting them. That's a very interesting area, and usually when I'm asked questions like this, I say, I just think about when I travel to Europe to meetings. Quite a few of the cities there, I know they're much smaller than London, but a lot of the central areas are pedestrianised, and it's actually very pleasant walking about, and they're not suffering from the same sort of pollution problems as we are. So I think we need to do a number of things, but we've got to retrofit our cities to make them, to make people move around more, so to get more exercise and to get the benefit of better air quality. On to vegetation, I'm not a big fan of it from an air quality improvement point of view, because we have had a lot of money spent on green walls, which are meant to be improving air quality. In reality, they may do a little bit, but it's actually very difficult to demonstrate that, and it certainly won't solve London's problem. So yes, plant trees for a beautification, to make cities greener and more pleasant to live in, but they're not going to solve our air pollution problem in my mind. And one of the reasons for that is obvious, that the pollution is produced on the street, you're walking on the pavement, the trees usually behind you. So it's not going to catch it before it goes through your lungs.
Needed that. Yeah.
All right, thanks. Hi, Frank.
Hi.
Hi, I'm Michaela Kendall from the University of Birmingham. I'm just interested in the environmental policy angle, because obviously air quality has been improved through environmental policy. It's a good news story. Has air quality ever improved without policy intervention? And do you know of any case where air quality no policy action was taken and air quality improved, or is it essential to introduce policy to improve that quality?
It's a very good question. I'm thinking off the top of my head here. I can't think of an example. No. And I think about the sources of air pollution, and its energy generation, and its movement of people, and its heating, and its cooking. And I can't think where there's been, a societal change which is not, which is something which society wants to do, which has led to that benefit. So I think you probably do need regulation. Yeah.
The shift from coal to gas generation in the 90s, early 90s in the UK.
But that was pushed by regulation, wasn't it?
Well, so, yeah, I mean, you didn't allow gas, and then you suddenly did allow gas. But the market kind of did that for itself. But yeah, you wanted to.
Hi, I'm Laura, and I'm from the MSc Energy Economics. And I just wanted to come back to the issue of electric cars and ask, because in Germany, for example, we have the target in the year 2020 have 1 million electric cars on the street, and they're pushing really forward. And isn't there any UK policy on that, to get a certain amount of electric cars?
Yes, there's, I'm not sure if, I can't think of the number, I can't think if it's 1 million or $500,000, but there is a scheme at the moment where the government will provide £5,000 towards the purchase of an electric car to incentivise it. And they also have put money into setting up charging networks in a lot of cities. So there is a push, but I guess because it hasn't really worked that much, the electric cars are, I think I saw a graph the other day, and maybe out of 15 EU countries, the UK was near the bottom of it. It really hasn't embraced, whereas I believe Norway, I think something like 20% of every new car, 1 in 5 is an electric car.
Because probably they would implement it first in big cities like London, where they could get the network of the power.
Yeah, I mean this current mayor is very positive for electric cars, but has not been able to deliver on it. Yeah.
Okay, we're going to wind it down fairly soon now. So if you really want to talk, want to ask a question, please show yourself. I've got a question.
I have two questions. The first one is, you mentioned that the congestion charging and the emission zones were not working. I don't know if you have time to at least highlight the most important facts why you think those are not working.
Yes.
And the second one is, the first study with children, you mentioned the loss of life according to, depending on the concentrations that they were exposed to. I don't know the California study or anything, but I would assume that those studies are based on like average concentrations and not their daily exposures. How reliable are those results using exposure levels based on concentration?
So I'll start with the children's study. So it wasn't loss of life, it was loss of lung growth. And in California, the studies, the exposure assessment was done by the monitoring in the local area of where these kids lived. So they either lived in an area which had busy roads running through it or beside it, as opposed to very rural areas. But it was central monitoring, and that's actually, a lot of epidemiology has been done that way over time. More recently, we've come up with good exposure models, and more recently the personal exposure equipment. But that was the assignment of exposure levels in California. The first question was around why aren't these schemes not working? Because these are big schemes in a big city. So the congestion charging scheme, very briefly, too small. It's right in the centre of London. It's 22 square kilometres, and London is 3,500 square kilometres or something. So it doesn't really influence enough vehicles. That's the problem with that. To defend it, it was never introduced to improve air quality. It was introduced to decrease congestion. And it did that for a while, but I think the speeds have fallen again since then. The low emission zone is all of London, and it was ambitious to improve air quality. The problem was it was introduced in phases. First the big heavy trucks, the 16.5 ton ones, and then 6 months after that the 12.5 tons are bigger. And then 6 months after that was meant to be the white vans, which there are a lot of in London, the white van equivalent vehicles, light duty vehicles. And that was delayed by 18 months by Boris Johnson, because he said it was not the right time because of the economic downturn to do that to small businesses, etc. So it was delayed. That has now been introduced, that third stage, about a year ago. But it's still, I mean, we don't have any private cars involved, and with all this public transport, you know, which is in the centre of London, as I've explained to you, is contributing to the problem, which is not, you know, it's not clean enough. So it's just not ambitious enough. We really need to be much stricter in the emissions of the vehicles that we do allow in, if it's going to work.
I mean, from a policy point of view, I'd like to stress what Frank said, that it was a congestion charge, not a congestion charge. Having said that, at the last mayoral election, it was a very clear choice between the two candidates. Ken Livingstone was going to extend the congestion charge so that it encompassed a much wider area, and indeed had done all the work to do that and was all set to introduce it. Boris Johnson said he was going to abolish that extension, and when he was elected he did abolish that extension, and so we didn't get that wider extension charge area which we would have had. It's a good example of saying that, I know it's quite fashionable for people to say it doesn't matter who you vote for, don't bother to vote, because whoever you vote for, you know, the same people get in. It's nonsense. And there was a very clear example of a policy decision with very great public health implications. One candidate did one thing, one another. It's not a party political point, but there is a very clear implication there of what came out of that election. Any more
on there?
Very quick one. No, we've had one from you, right? That's all right, and we've got two more. I'm going to take them together. Frank's going to wrap up, and we're going to go upstairs and have some refreshments. So,
my name is Jorge Gomez, URS, and a couple of questions. very interesting the presentations about schools, and very, very interesting the epidemiological studies you could carry out. So we understand the problem in London that is very polluted, but the reality is that the schools are still there. Schools are being built, and so what would be your recommendation for those new schools or for existing schools in order to avoid or reduce potential exposure of kids to poor air quality?
Okay, thanks Frank. We'll think about that while we take the last question from that gentleman. Did you want a question? No, are you sure? Because you kind of caught my eye at one point.
It was, but then it's okay.
Okay.
So I suppose how long? And I suppose a supplementary there. We talked about non-policy measures with the direct action taken over in Hong Kong. While unrelated, did have a dramatic improvement, I'm told, in the air quality by stopping the cars on the road. And you think as this issue becomes more in the public conscious and aware, do you think there will actually be direct action taken from citizens, or what action could citizens take?
Yeah, thank you. Schools, when California got that information from their study, it subsequently led to the introduction of a new law that no school could be built within 500 meters of any busy route. So that's the sort of action you could take. Challenging in a big city like London, of course. The schools that we've already got, practically what you could do if you're in charge of transport, you could try and minimize the dirtiest vehicles going anywhere near those routes. So we have within our fleet now, our bus fleet, we have no buses clean, but we have cleaner buses than some of the other ones. So you could look to reroute those. This has happened in Putney High Street because the residents there have cried wolf. Building new schools, think about, not allowing major transport to get near them, to have buffer zones and things like that. But clearly they've got to be, if they're in a city, they've got to be near where the people are living, etc. So it's a balance, very, very difficult. What would I do? I've just forgotten. You said in Europe, will it make any difference? Is that right? Yeah, yeah. I'm not very optimistic, because if I put myself on the other side of the fence and then think, if it was my job to do something about it, what would I do? I can see the problems. So what I always say at this point is, we're all part of the problem. So one of the things we should be doing, the government should be doing, is increasing awareness. So, if you think about the tobacco lobby and how long it took us to ban cigarettes, it's not going to happen overnight. But we need people to understand that there is this link. And at this point in time, there's only you guys in this room and the other people I've talked to, for the last couple of years that understand that. And that's not a big sector of the population. So I'm not that optimistic that we're going to see a lot of change quick enough, unfortunately. And in Hong Kong, you said, yep, air quality did improve whenever those roads were closed. Yeah, no, it's true, and I happened to be there, and I observed it, which was very lucky. But in fact, in London, two of our busiest streets, you know about Oxford Street now, another one is Regent Street. Every year, the company that looks after that area, that shopping area, is called the New West End Company, and every year they have 3 or 4 traffic-free days, so they actually just block the roads off. It's absolutely fantastic shopping experience for everybody that goes, because they can wander about and not worry about anything. We've monitored those days on behalf of the New West End Company. Pollution levels plummet. So it does work if we can get people away from using transport and walking.
Okay, and of course the Putney High Street example is another one which I didn't know about. If you make a noise, you can get local councils to do something. We do a lot of work here on hydrogen, and so we are very closely linked into the Hydrogen Vehicle Partnership, which is thinking about hydrogen buses, of which there are 6 in London. They go along down by Waterloo.
RV1s, yep.
See them every now and again. So, I mean, there are solutions, and they cost money.
£250,000, I hear.
Indeed. Frank, thank you very much. It's been absolutely terrific.
Thank you. Thank you.